Today is March 9th, 2026, and we are going to be going over the recent ceasefire that took place related to the war between the US and Israel and Iran. I was actually going to cover this yesterday when the ceasefire, during the first day of the ceasefire, but I wanted to let some of the dust settle first to see if things would flare back up 24 hours after the ceasefire was announced. And so far, things have been shaky, but the ceasefire is held together. There's supposed to be a meeting. We'll be getting into that on Saturday. J.D. Vance will head a delegation to Islamabad, Pakistan. And there's going to be a meeting. J.D. Vance, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, Pakistani mediators, and Iranian representatives. It'll be the first meeting of probably many. So it's, we're kind of seeing this cycle starting all over again. But we'll break it down and get into some of the details. And we last spoke about a week ago when we were nearing the end of just one of several of the fake ultimatums that Trump has presented to the Iranians. And we're going to review the several ultimatums that eventually brought us nothing but, as I just said, full circle back to the negotiating table. So on March 21st, there was a post on Trump's Truth Social account where he declared that if Iran did not fully open the strait within 48 hours, the U.S. would obliterate the power plants, starting with the biggest one first, in his words. The first of many threats on Iran's civilian infrastructure, an upgrade from the military infrastructure that the U.S. has been hitting for the past month, or a little over a month now, or it lasted, I think, about 39 to 40 days, hostilities before the ceasefire. On the 23rd of March, 2 days after, he issued another threat, and he said that the United States, after the threat, actually, he issued a statement saying that the United States had productive conversations with Iran and that he had ordered the Pentagon to postpone any strikes on Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for 5 days. And of course, during these discussions, these posts and statements that Trump has made, he's been consistently saying that, well, we're basically negotiating with a parallel government. This isn't the regime that was in place before. These are other people that are more reasonable. And we're really getting far with these negotiations and these talks. We're far along. He kept reiterating it over the past week. And we've still seen no sign of a new regime in place. These, I would say, imaginary forces that Trump was negotiating with behind the scenes. So that was the 23rd of March. March 30th, Trump claimed that, again, there was great progress in the negotiations to end the war. A lot of people think that he's just negotiating with himself, but so there was great progress. And at the same time, he threatened that if a deal was not reached and the Strait of Hormuz were not immediately opened, the U.S. would destroy all of Iran's power plants and oil wells, as well as Karg Island, Iran's main oil hub, and possibly all of their desalination plants. And of course, anyone who's watching this knows that the desalination plants throughout the Middle East, the Gulf countries, are vital for the survival of the people there. I've read reports that I think that if these desalination plants were destroyed, a country like Saudi Arabia would only have like a month, I think about a month of fresh water to survive. And notice that we've discussed before the shifting objectives that the administration has described for why we're in this war in the first place. You have the changing of the regime, which Trump announced on day one. He wanted to see regime change, the people rising up to overthrow the regime. He wanted the ballistic missiles program cut off completely, the nuclear program, obviously, the proxies fighting through the Middle East that Iran has been sponsoring for quite some time. None of these objectives were actually achieved. You had a slight degradation of the military and the military infrastructure in Iran. But then the new objective that was created through the war itself was the closing of the strait. And this is predominantly where what all these threats, as you can hear, are directed towards. These threats are directed at Iran because the strait continues to be under their control and the shipping continues to be threatened. So on April 1st, Mr. Trump said that Iran had asked for a ceasefire, a claim that Iran's foreign ministry obviously rejected as false and baseless. And Mr. Trump wrote on social media that the U.S. would consider a ceasefire only when the strait was open, free and clear. He added, until then, we are blasting Iran into oblivion, or as they say, back to the Stone Ages, which isn't possible. It's possible it would take a lot of time, which we'll get into in a moment when we study some of the other, the specifics of some of these threats. But if you take, for example, Iran's energy infrastructure, it's widely dispersed across the country. And if the Russo-Ukrainian war is any example, the Russians have taken a couple years to completely, and I think that this was more methodical and strategic, but it took them quite some time to bring Ukraine to bring Ukraine's electrical grid to the point of collapse, close to the point of collapse. It took several years for them to do that. And so if that's any measuring stick for what Trump is wanting to do in Iran, it would take likely several months for the energy infrastructure at least to be knocked out. Of course, he's not just talking about the electrical grid, but, it would take some time. And I doubt that the U.S. has the resources presently to do that. April 4th, 2 days before his postponed deadline for Iran to open the strait, Mr. Trump said the time is running out, 48 hours before all hell will rain down on them. Now, this post came after he made several conflicting statements about the strait in the preceding days, alternately attacking allies for not fighting to reopen it themselves and saying it would reopen naturally. And he's oscillated on this issue. As it relates to to NATO assisting in opening the straits. In one breath, he's saying we don't need them. In another, he's saying the strait is open and people and shippers should just go through it. Then he's threatening Iran. He's threatening to withdraw from NATO because NATO hasn't been supportive of him trying to reopen the strait. So you could see this is a man who's very disturbed. He's going in many different directions. And that was evident, of course, on Easter with the tweet with his truth that he sent out. And as many of you know, he posted some of his most disturbing truth posts between Sunday and Monday of this week, right before the deadline. From explicitly laden demands to open the fucking strait, to threats of exterminating Iranian civilization, the people. So this was obviously desperation time. And if you look at the mosaic of Trump's truth posts since he's gotten back into office, these posts and the content specifically shouldn't be too surprising. It's morally repugnant, but it shouldn't be surprising that it's gotten to this point. From last year to right now, you've heard him mock people who have died, Robert Mueller, and who was the meathead from All in the Family, Rob Reiner, and his wife killed by their son, mocking that situation. So this has kind of been building up to a crescendo. And if anything, I would say there was a lot of commentary about, again, the specifics of what he said in these posts. And it was sensational and, again, morally reprehensible. But what it points towards overall, taking these truth posts all together, is, again, someone who's mentally going somewhere that isn't helpful and dangerous for the rest of the country, to say the least. I try not to be too, I try not to go too far in thinking in these terms. I don't want to sound too sensationalist or alarmed, but it has gotten to the point where many within the MAGA movement, the Republican Party, are a little worried and shaken up by some of this behavior. Many people think that it's some kind of mad doctrine where he wants to instill as much ambiguity and doubt within the Iranians and their position. But I would say that this is desperation, insecurity, fear, and we'll get into some of the reasons why in a moment. So this brings us to Monday and the 90 minutes before Trump was going to essentially genocide the Iranian people. A ceasefire was announced. And so this is from the Wall Street Journal here, and it says, quote, President Trump backed down Tuesday from a threat to wipe out the entirety of Iranian civilization, saying he agreed to a 2-week ceasefire with Iran in hopes the country will be able to finalize a long-term peace agreement. Trump posted and said, we have recently met and exceeded all military objectives and are very far along with the definitive agreement concerning long-term peace with Iran and peace in the Middle East. Of course, we don't know whether all the military objectives have been achieved. I'm kind of saying the obvious. Given what happened last week with this F-15 that was shot down, which we're going to get into in a moment, Iranian airspace obviously wasn't clear, right? Iranian airspace was still dangerous. A lot of the projectiles fired by Israel and the US were fired from the periphery, from aircraft. And so you can take with it what you want. Of course, we always take what Trump says on his Truth Social with a grain of salt. He also said the agreement was subjective to the Islamic Republic of Iran agreeing to complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz, which hasn't happened, as we'll get into in just a moment. The strait remains under the control of Iran, and they are charging tolls and letting a very tiny proportion of shipping through the strait. Iran said it had achieved its war aims and signaled its intent to continue control over the strait. Trump, in his post on Truth Social, said the U.S. has received a 10-point proposal from Iran that was workable basis on which to negotiate. He said that almost all of the various points of past contention have been agreed to, and that the 2-week period will allow the agreement to be finalized and consummated. And of course, we've heard a lot of this before in the recent rounds of negotiations that have happened before the hostilities took place in 2025 with Operation Midnight Hammer, and then, of course, with this Operation Epic Fury that has been taking place over the past couple months. We're always close to a deal, and then hostilities begin. And a note on the 10-point proposal that Iran presented. Iran has presented a variation of this 10-point plan that was maximalist to the administration. So many are thinking that this is the proposal that Trump is referring to when he's saying that this is something workable and we're hammering out the details with the Iranians presently. However, yesterday, Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, gave a conference, the press pool, and she said that that proposal was actually thrown into the trash by President Trump when he received it because of its demands, and that there's another 10-point plan that apparently has been tightened up, and this is the one that Trump was referring to. So it's an alternative plan that's apparently different than the one that Iran had presented to the U.S. about 2 weeks ago. So what it sounds like is that both sides have separate plans. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, the U.S. proposed a 15-point plan that we talked about in our previous video. And most of the demands in that 15-point plan were unacceptable to Iran, including no more enriched uranium, giving up the enriched uranium they already have, et cetera, et cetera. And then after that, Iran proposed their 10-point plan. So you have two maximalist plans. I would contend that perhaps right now they're trying to, bridge the differences between those plans. And a lot of some of what Iran is demanding, like, for example, the Strait, very likely could be included in any deal that's brokered over the course of these future negotiations. And we'll touch on that later. And I thought about this when I was going through this article, and I said, I wonder where the talk is now of the alternative government that Trump was negotiating with, the alternative Iranian government that he was negotiating with. In his mind, he's still out there parroting this line that the regime has fallen and that there are alternative personnel within Iran that are being negotiated or that are taking part in negotiations being brokered by Pakistan. We haven't heard any of that over the past couple of days. So the article continues, Iran's Supreme National Security Council reiterated Tehran's own plan for a peace deal, which includes the regulated passage through the Strait of Hormuz under the coordination of the armed forces of Iran, thereby conferring upon Iran a unique economic and geopolitical standing. And going back for a moment to the situation regarding this 10-point plan, or whatever version we're talking about, when this statement came out from the press secretary yesterday, and even Trump had posted on Truth Social that there was an alternative 10-point plan that wasn't exactly what Iran had presented in the first place, or at least he alluded to it in the post. We haven't heard too much pushback from the Iranians on that, so it sounds like that might be accurate. How different the plan is, I'm not thinking. I would speculate that it's not too different, but we'll see soon, I suppose. Now, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said on X, for a period of 2 weeks, safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz will be possible via coordination with Iran's armed forces and with due consideration of technical limitations. It will be possible. And this is the basis on which Trump has agreed to the ceasefire. The U.S. acknowledged Iran's terms for the situation in the Strait, with the White House and Trump reposting the Iranian foreign minister's statement on Truth Social. So you would think that that's basically like a confirmation. Abbas Araghchi, their foreign minister, said, well, basically we're going to manage the Strait ourselves, which is, of course, a huge win. And that passage for shipping would be possible. And that's the key word there. Possible. So, as we'll see later on, there's going to only be a small volume of shipping that's going to be transiting the Strait, and that's going to be coordinated by the IRGC, Iran's naval forces. And so they will be maintaining control of it. This was acknowledged by the U.S. with Trump reposting it. And it seems like this status quo is one in which the administration is willing to live with at the present time. Trump even went as far as to say in a post, a Truth Social post, that something that would be beautiful is if the U.S. and Iran managed the Strait and Strait traffic together. Now that, you could take with that what you want, but that's an interesting statement. And you have to wonder why Trump at this moment is being so sounding as conciliatory as he has. Now, peppered through all of these statements over the past couple of days have been the threats, obviously. But it's important also to recognize some of the conciliatory language coming from him and how desperate he sounds in terms of finding a resolution to this issue. So we go on here. Iran's national, Supreme National Security Council said that negotiations with the U.S. will start Friday in Islamabad, Pakistan's capital, and that's been basically updated to it's going to be happening Saturday. The council said the 2-week ceasefire could be extended if both sides agree, which is what I'm wagering. Again, if history is any standard here, these negotiations, when they start, I'm sure that by Saturday morning, we'll be hearing that the talks were preliminary, they went well, and that they're going to be returning to the negotiating table within maybe a week or 2 weeks, and that the deadline has been extended for the ceasefire. Now, Pakistan helped broker the ceasefire negotiations, and its Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, said the ceasefire deal applied to fighting everywhere, including Lebanon. But the office of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the ceasefire doesn't apply to Lebanon, which Israel has invaded in a bid to beat back the Tehran-backed militia Hezbollah. Now, the reason that this portion is important is because shortly after the ceasefire, both sides traded salvos, missile salvos. Iran shot missiles into the Arab states and at Israel. I don't know how many of them were shot down. I didn't see any information on that. And Israel yesterday has fired several salvos, hundreds of salvos of missiles into Lebanon within 10 minutes, killing over 200 people and wounding thousands more. And that's why I said earlier in the video that I was kind of waiting for the dust to clear to see if hostilities would formally commence, or if this was just what typically happens when there's a ceasefire in the Middle East. The ceasefire is announced, the sides trade a couple more blows, and then the dust settles, which has been, again, historically the case since 2023 when Israel went to war with Gaza. You see these several ceasefires taking place over the past couple of years. That's typically the trend. And this nearly broke down the ceasefire yesterday. Iran was threatening, Iran did again, they were saying they closed the strait again, and that essentially if the US doesn't get Israel under control, that they would continue in hostilities. They would restart hostilities. This idea that Lebanon was included in the ceasefire terms has been disputed by the administration. Yesterday, again, in that press conference, Caroline Levitt said that Lebanon wasn't included. J.D. Vance has come out today and said Lebanon wasn't included. This is obviously disputed by Iran and Pakistan, the broker of the ceasefire, with Pakistan's prime minister coming out after the ceasefire was announced with a statement that included language that incorporated Lebanon in a cessation of hostilities in Lebanon in the ceasefire. And so, with Pakistan saying that, it's a little bit more believable to me that it actually was included, but the U.S. is likely unable to put a check on Israel's hostilities against Lebanon. Trump noted that those hostilities between Israel and Lebanon was more of a side skirmish, and that it's not involved in the larger conflagration between Israel and Iran. But Iran obviously doesn't see it that way. Now today, it was just released before I recorded this, that Netanyahu and Israel have decided to halt hostilities with Lebanon and go to the negotiating table to negotiate a separate ceasefire there. So that's a bit of good news. It sounds like Israel just wanted to call the shots with Lebanon. They weren't satisfied with the ceasefire being announced at all. And so this is kind of their way of biting back, launching these missile strikes against Beirut and taking a day to do what they want to do, and then coming out later and 2 days later and saying, well, okay, we'll go to the negotiating table with Hezbollah. So the article continues, Republicans in Congress praised the president's announcement, but the usual suspects like Senator Lindsey Graham, a close ally of the president, raised some red flags about the ceasefire. He said, quote, as to an Iranian 10-point proposal to end the war, I look forward to reviewing it at the appropriate time and its submission to Congress for a vote. What's interesting, of course, is that he didn't want the proposal to go to war in the first place to go to Congress for a vote. He didn't care if it went to the UN, but he wants this proposal. And I would assume any peace that's brokered between the US, Israel, and Iran, someone like him and the many people within the Republican Party in the Senate and the House are going to want some kind of a congressional approval for any results, for any proposal, or not proposal, but any agreement brokered in the future. And they're going to try their best to hold that up. They're going to try their best to torpedo any agreement that comes out of the negotiations that are about to take place. He went on and said, "I want to reaffirm that from my point of view, every ounce of the approximately 900 pounds of highly enriched uranium has to be controlled by the US and removed from Iran to prevent them in the future from having a dirty bomb or returning to the enrichment business," he wrote. So ostensibly, this doesn't take an invasion off the table if these forces are still actively seeking to remove the uranium from Iran. They're highly enriched, 60% highly enriched uranium, and the cascades, the infrastructure that enriches the uranium, I'm sure they'll want to remove from the country as well. But for the record, I do think that the ceasefire is likely to hold indefinitely. There's going to be skirmishes. There has been, for example, when the ceasefire between Gaza and Israel commenced last year. To this day, there are still skirmishes between Hamas and Israel. So that when we see this happening over the course of the next couple of weeks, it's likely that a formal resumption of hostilities will commence. There will likely be salvos traded between the Gulf countries in Iran, Israel and Iran, Israel and Lebanon. That's likely to continue, albeit at a less intensive level than what we've seen over the past month. And again, this is evident through the history of these conflicts in the Middle East, starting with the attack on Israel by Hamas in 2023. So we're going to touch now on some of these, on particularly the Strait of Hormuz and how that's being managed. As we just noted, Iran has resumed control over the strait and what ships can pass in and out of the strait. And so the idea that Trump put out that Iran has opened the strait and ships and cargo ships are free to pass through, it's just not true. They are managing the strait. The Associated Press has emphasized Thursday Iran's approval system for ships granting safe passage after vetting by the Islamic Revolutionary Corps. And that remains unchanged despite US President Trump's demand for the strait to be reopened. Last week was the busiest week since the start of the war, with 72 passages. Now, this is still 90% below the volumes that were passing through before the war started, the AP reports. But most of the vessels allowed through are connected to Iran, although some Indian vessels have gotten through with diplomatic intervention from the Indian government. Now, since the ceasefire took place, 4 ships have passed through the strait yesterday on Wednesday, the fewest so far in April. And this was according to the S&P Global Market Intelligence. This is down from more than 100 a day before the war. Now, Iran is requiring ships to work out toll arrangements ahead of time and pay fees in cryptocurrency or Chinese yuan. And this is according to the mediators and ship brokers. In the waterway Wednesday morning, Iran was broadcasting via maritime VHF radio that ships without permission to cross from the IRGC risk being destroyed, according to a recording a crew member shared with the Wall Street Journal. The message was addressed to all the vessels in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman. Apologies for that break there. So essentially what we're seeing right now, as we were just going over the shipping detail, the shipping in the strait still remains firmly within Iran's control. Now, Russia, which is an ally of Iran, has in its media published sources saying that Iran will allow no more than 15 vessels per day through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, following comes via TASS on Thursday, and this is Russia's state-sponsored media outlet. TASS said, quote, under the ceasefire agreement, Iran will allow no more than 15 ship vessels per day to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And this is from a senior Iranian official. Under the current ceasefire, fewer than 15 ships per day. This movement is strictly contingent upon Iran's approval and the enforcement of a specific protocol. The new regulatory framework operating under the supervision of the IRGC has been officially communicated to regional parties. There will be no return to the pre-war status quo, the source said. And there really isn't much the administration can do outside of what they were talking about a week ago, which is somehow forcing the strait open by occupying the islands at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, which just isn't going to happen, at least not right now. And I think the chances of that happening are much lower than what we thought last week. So the same source additionally indicated that the unfreezing of Iran's blocked assets is a critical executive guarantee that must be realized within the 2-week time frame. And I think that basically what we're going to see there is that just being one of the negotiating points. Unfreezing Iran's assets, again, brings me back to the situation in the Russo-Ukrainian war. So, for example, the idea of the U.S. unfreezing or removing sanctions from Russia, Russian assets, Russian individuals would have been difficult because the EU would have had to sign on to that, to the removal of those sanctions or unblocking frozen assets. The EU would have had to have been involved in that. And I would say that that's likely going to be the case now with Iran. The EU, the US will have to go back and forth on whether or not to unfreeze some of these assets or even remove sanctions from Iran or various Iranian entities and individuals. And so if that is going to be a stipulation by the Iranians, that is another indication that negotiations will take some time. And it's very likely, again, that those negotiations will be allowed to run their course. Goes on here, also Iran is demanding that the end of the war must be formalized in a resolution of the UN Security Council. Now, that will likely never happen, but it goes back to what I was saying earlier about Congress. So if Iran is requiring that any resolution is approved by the UN Security Council, it's very likely, again, that Congress is going to wake up and you try to use their leverage to torpedo any resolution or treaty that's signed between Israel, the US, and Iran. These treaties will need constitutionally have to be approved by Congress. And so that's going to be difficult. That's going to be a roadblock. When you consider that half of our congressional leaders on the Republican and Democrat side are owned by Israel and the Israel lobby, the likelihood of them allowing anything like that to pass, giving anything at all to Iran, whether it's allowing them to enrich to a certain percentage, to retain control over the straits, anything that sweetens the deal, an agreement for Iran, will be a roadblock in getting through Congress and likely approval from the UN. If the termination of the war is not codified, this is from Iranian sources, but Iran says, quote, if the termination of the war is not codified into a UN Security Council resolution based on our stipulated terms, we are fully prepared to resume combat against the US and the Zionist regime, just as we have over the past 40 days and with even greater intensity, the source told TASS. Iran is further saying that the US cannot build up more forces in the region during the 2-week ceasefire interim. As for Iran's protocol for allowing passage, which reportedly could include up to a $2 million fee per vessel payable in cryptocurrency, Lloyd's listing outlines the following on where things stand. So vessels transiting the choke point, IRGC coordinates that. Iran's latest guidance explicitly warns of anti-ship mines in the main traffic zone of the strait. Iran's Navy continues to vet all traffic passing through the strait on the basis of geopolitical affiliation. Certain countries are allowed to go through with the fee. Certain countries, for example, like China, shipping tied to China will be allowed to go through for free. Any vessels tied to Israel or the US or forces deemed to be hostile to Iran will not be allowed to transit the strait. So overall, taken the war itself and the ceasefire, Iran has certainly came out on top in this situation where we stand right now. Their regime is still intact. Their proxies throughout the Middle East are still intact in Iraq, in Lebanon. The Houthis are still very active in threatening the other shipping route. As I said, they retain control of the strait. And we have to ask ourselves, what it was all for? Why did we see this change of heart over the course of the past week? Now, I think in the case of the constant increasingly unhinged threats coming from Trump, we saw desperation, as I mentioned earlier, in some of the tweets that he put out this weekend, and panic. And I would say this is due to not only the trajectory of the war itself, but following the F-15 shootdown last week and subsequent rescue mission, I say in quotes, which many have speculated was part of a larger attempt by special forces to obtain the remaining highly enriched uranium from Isfahan. Now, this is an item, this is the last point that we'll touch on from national interest, and it touches on some of the major losses we've had since the war started relative to aircraft. We have to remember last week when this F-15 was shot down and everything that followed. Trump described basically a 100-man mission, plenty of military hardware that went into Iran, deep into Iran and into Isfahan to extract one of two. The first one was rescued, and then the second pilot was still out there in Iran. And there was this mammoth attempt to rescue him, which they did. But a lot of specialists said that for a rescue mission like this, certain aircraft, for example, that was used would not have been used unless there was another mission involved, which again, many are speculating was a mission to try to extract the remaining highly enriched uranium that is thought to be buried in the rubble after it's been bombed several times in this iteration of the war and last year. Now, if that's the case, if there was a major mission like that underway and it was botched and we lost several aircraft in that mission, then that may have been the last attempt or the farthest that Trump was willing to go or take things. Not an invasion of the islands in the Strait of Hormuz, not a land invasion completely, not even using special forces, all the special forces that have been built up in the region. This may have been the special operation that many who were paying attention were waiting for. But just some notes on that situation that unfolded. The U.S. Air Force saw the Iranian military shoot down an F-15E Strike Eagle with a shoulder-fired missile, while another A-10 Thunderbolt number 2 was lost in the subsequent rescue mission, the A-10 Warthogs. More than a dozen fixed-wing aircraft have now been lost or damaged in the air campaign over Iran, in addition to roughly the same number of helicopters and drones. As previously reported, the first aircraft nominally shot down over Iran was an F-35A Lightning II, which was forced to make an emergency landing after being hit by ground fire. And the ground fire is a sight to be seen. On certain Telegram channels, you'll see, and might consider it propaganda, whatever you want to say, but civilians, like security forces within Iran, see these low-flying helicopters, and they're actually using some of them bolt-action rifles, long-range rifles, to try to shoot these aircraft out of the sky. So this doesn't at all seem like the Iranian people looking to free themselves from the chains of their oppressive government. This looks like Trump has sort of solidified some form of nationalistic sentiment within Iran. Whereas, of course, not all of the people are on board with their government or any of these things, but a sizable amount of the country naturally is rallying behind their country and their sovereignty and that kind of thing. So the article continues, that incident came just days after a U.S. Air Force KC-135 refueler crashed in western Iraq, killing 6 airmen. Another KC-35 was confirmed to have been damaged on the ground in Saudi Arabia during an Iranian missile strike. And many of these aircraft, if you see the satellite images, are actually sitting out in the open. And talk about learning nothing from the Russo-Ukrainian war. For example, Operation Spiderweb that was carried out by Ukraine, I believe last year, targeted aircraft in Russia, deep inside of Russia. Drones targeted aircraft deep inside of Russia that were out in the open. They didn't have any cover over these massive aircraft, and so they were exposed. These will be 2 videos. This is the second of 2 videos. I was trying to pause my previous video on the ceasefire, and I ended up pressing the stop button. So we're just going to continue where we left off, even if this video probably doesn't get any views because the other one is kind of long. So I just want to finish wrapping up here. This is, again, an article from the National Interest talking about some of the losses in aircraft that the U.S. has suffered since the Iran war started, and why these losses and this potentially botched operation to extract Iran's highly enriched uranium could be some of the contributing factors that drove Trump to wanting a ceasefire even more urgently into the negotiating table. So, where we left off was the incident, the KC-135 that was damaged on the ground in Saudi Arabia after an Iranian missile strike a couple weeks ago. We were talking about Operation Spiderweb, where Ukrainian drones went deep into Russia and damaged many of their aircraft that was sitting out in the open without covering. And you would think the U.S. would have learned a lesson from this, not to park the aircraft out in the open. But there were losses on that end. So in addition, an E-3 Sentry, one of just 16 in service, was also destroyed on the ground. The Sentry had been vital for tracking airborne threats, including missiles, and for surveilling and monitoring the region's airspace or battle space. In the open days of the fighting, 3 F-15E Strike Eagles were mistakenly shot down by Kuwaiti air defenses. That could have been a case of war nerves, but these losses are hardly insignificant. The damage to the F-35 and the loss of the F-35E Strike Eagle to an Iranian Manpads launcher is a reminder of the dangers, even as Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has suggested Iran's air defense capabilities have been destroyed, and President Donald Trump has said Iran is unable to carry on the fight. Over and over again, we've heard this, that Iran is weak. They have no air defenses. They have no way to defend their airspace. They've been beaten. We've won. We've heard those statements so many times. And obviously, that just wasn't the case, especially when you consider the losses in our aircraft hardware. Now, just for comparison, between 2003, the invasion of Iraq, and February of 2009, a total of 129 helicopters and 24 fixed-wing aircraft were lost in the conflict in the Middle East. Of these, only a third were attributed to hostile fire, including enemy anti-aircraft artillery and surface-to-air missiles. 2/3 came from friendly fire or crashes. So in the 20-year-long conflict in Afghanistan, no U.S. fixed-wing fighters were shot down by enemy fire, though at least 70 helicopters were lost in enemy action. In other words, Iran has already destroyed or damaged more U.S. aircraft in the span of a month than Saddam Hussein's forces could in all of 2003, or the insurgent groups in the decades that followed. Operation Epic Fury might seem to be taking place in similar territory, but the capabilities of Iran are significantly greater than those of Iraq and Afghanistan a quarter of a century later. And I think that this is sort of important perspective here. And perhaps, as I said before, one of the driving factors for the urgency for the administration to get out, to get away from hostilities. So the adventure was becoming too costly ultimately. Any operations either to secure the uranium or force the Strait open would have been too risky, number one, logistically. And number two, it's an election year. We're already close to the middle of the year. Summer is here. And midterms are going to be kicking up into high gear. Risking some kind of excursion to capture these islands in the Strait of Hormuz would likely take months. Number one. When you consider the idea of going into the middle of Iran to try to extract the uranium and the enriched uranium and the cascades used to enrich the uranium and all of the equipment, you consider the breadth and scope of an operation like that right in the middle of midterms. I mean, you're talking about months. You would need more assets than are there right now. Obviously, given what we've seen over the past weekend with this F-15 and what could have been an attempt to remove the uranium, how do you think that would pan out, especially in an election year? Now, again, Trump is not running again. He probably doesn't care too much what happens to the Republicans in the House and the Senate, but he does care what happens to him. He does care only about himself. And the one thing that he still doesn't want to see, even though he can't run again, he doesn't want to be impeached. And any kind of high risk endeavor, like, again, forcing the Strait open or extracting the uranium, carries so much risk. And if it's botched, if it's botched again, and you have a significant amount of a significant loss of life in terms of American personnel, he's finished in terms of his presidency. Finished. Now, the threat to essentially, and again, this brings us also to the threat to essentially that Trump put out to essentially raise Iran. You know, kill millions of civilians potentially. That was never tenable. So, in light of all of these, the idea that it was becoming too costly, the options that were on the table were likely not feasible politically, militarily, at least in the short run. Going nuclear, trying to raise the entire country, kill millions of people, destroy their infrastructure, and this kind of thing. None of these options were going to work. So the administration essentially had to retreat. So what else would they have had to target? You know, if they didn't have to retreat, they likely would have. The administration would have likely still been bombing. Israel would have likely still been bombing targets within Iran. They've probably gotten everything they can get, and most of what they were hitting were likely decoys. So the ceasefire, as I said in part one of this video, will likely be extended indefinitely, because as mentioned above, the U.S. is truly out of viable options from a military standpoint and a political standpoint. Now, hopefully I'm not sounding like I'm overstating that. Of course, there's plenty of things you can do to disrupt Iran and continue to see out the operations. The many have tried to accomplish all the objectives that Trump has tried to highlight, but it would take a lot of time. And the more time that we spend over there, the higher the risk of something catastrophic happening, especially to our troops. So that's something that would not have been allowed, it wouldn't have been acceptable right now. So 5 questions we have to think about in closing. Can the truce move forward amid Israel's offensive in Lebanon? Well, I think that it will, because Israel is going to be negotiating with Lebanon. They'll likely still be firing at them. There's going to be still salvos launched, but they're going to probably negotiate, because the administration is probably putting pressure on them to do so. Who will control the Strait of Hormuz? I don't think that Iran's not going to be giving that up. Again, the U.S. has no leverage to force them to change the status quo over there. They're going to take the money that they get from the tolls. They're going to rebuild their country. In the short term, at least, that's a pretty good deal for them. And that's because their assets and the sanctions will not be removed anytime soon. If that's a discussion that's on the table, for example, sanctions, it's likely going to happen very gradually. And as for unfrozen assets, Obama, back before he left office in his second term, unfroze many of Iran's assets. And in light of the nuclear deal that John Kerry and the Obama administration brokered, and you wouldn't believe the uproar on the Republican side. You remember the pallets of cash story that was pushed around that time that was sent to Iran? Well, that was frozen money that they already owned. And so the idea that they're going to be able to barter this, they're going to be able to say, well, look, we'll unfreeze some of your assets, we'll take some sanctions off, but you got to do something about the strait. I think it's far more likely that they retain control of the strait and they make plenty of money. Maybe at the most, they control the strait with the US, which I think is unlikely. And in return, they give up the enriched uranium and still are allowed to enrich up to a certain point. I would say that's probably something that's being discussed. At the minimum, something will have to be discussed, because now Trump has got the Iranians have plenty of leverage over the US. They've shown that they have their own nuclear option, basically. What happens to their nuclear program? Well, like I just said, there's going to probably be a trade-off, and I do believe that it's likely that the enriched uranium will be given up, but the capability won't be traded. They maintain that that's part of their sovereign right to enrich uranium. Now, perhaps some iteration of what was discussed last year or leading up to these hostilities will happen, and the Russians will be able to take the uranium and hold it in Russia. Unlikely, but it'll probably be a third country, not the US, that'll hold their enriched uranium. Number 4, will Iran keep its missiles? I think that's a given. You know, that's part of their national security infrastructure. They're not going to give up their missiles. Now, will there be limitations on the kind of missiles that they can produce? Probably. That would be delving into minutia that would again extend those negotiations likely past midterms. Will the United States lift sanctions? We already went over that. If they did, it would be gradual, and the U.S. wouldn't have a problem doing that, or just keeping the sanctions on, since, you know, especially if they say, well, you know, if the U.S., if Trump folds on the straits and Iran is able to make money and build their country up with that money, he's probably going to deprioritize lifting sanctions, even though that's one of the requirements that Iran has. There's going to be a lot of give and take. There's going to have to be. Or I suppose hostilities will start over again. But my bet is that it's the kinetic part of this situation is finished. So anyways, that does it for me. Again, if you haven't seen the first part of the video, I encourage you to take a look at it. And if you've liked what you've heard, please indicate that by liking the video or subscribing. Thanks for joining me.